This artist started with this and ended up with this. How did this mesmerizing transformation happen, and why do Francisco Goya's later paintings seem prophetic? Hello everyone, it's me again, Nina Shev. And today we will travel back to the 18th century to the fascinating story of Spain's most unusual artist, Francisco Goya. He was born in 1746 in Zaragoza, Spain, into a poor family of a local craftsman. They struggled with money, so only at the age of 13 did he enter the Zaragoza Academy of Drawing, which was headed by José Luzán. This was quite late, since children were typically sent at age 10. He studied there for 4 years, and after graduating, he took part in a competition at the Royal Academy of Fine Arts with a pencil sketch of the statue of Selene, but he didn't win anything. In general, as an artist, he developed slowly, so his first mature works appeared very late. 3 years later, when he finally succeeded, he was already 20 years old, and by all standards, he should have already started supporting himself. He went to Madrid and tried to win the competition again, but once again, he was unsuccessful. Participating in such competitions was extremely important for aspiring artists, especially those who were poor. It gave them hope of receiving a scholarship to study in Rome, so the competition was fierce. However, that year, the winner of the competition was Ramón Bayo, the brother of Francisco's future brother-in-law. As you can see, the start of the young artist's career can hardly be called spectacular, but there are people who, when faced with failure, blame everyone around them and give up. And then there's Goya, who, disappointed with the official paths, asked to become an assistant to the artist Francisco Bayo, the older brother of that very Ramón Bayo who had won the competition. As soon as he married Goya's aunt and became his relative, Bayo received a commission to decorate none other than the royal palace in Madrid. He was the royal artist. The young Goya saw this as a great opportunity, and who wouldn't? And so, in 1764, at the age of 21, he moved to Madrid, where he was surrounded by all the most famous works of art in the Spanish kingdom. And this is a very important moment for self-development. At that time, there were only 2 ways to learn, and the teacher would pass on to the student his own personal vision and the techniques he himself possessed. Or study the works of the greats, their style, manner, color palette, and techniques. But while for the first option, any village teacher with a known result would do, of course, the second was not available to everyone. At that time, there were hardly any museums, and access to the royal palace was limited to a very select few, so for a poor artist from Zaragoza, getting in was a rare stroke of luck. And having gained precious access to the treasures, Goya spent 5 whole years as an apprentice studying the works of the masters and trying to adopt their style and techniques. We know little about this period of his life, but in 1765 he painted a fresco for the Jesuits of Alagon called The Exaltation of the Name of Jesus, and the following year, a series called Fathers of the Latin or Western Church for the Jesuits of Calatayud. All these 5 years, after 2 unsuccessful attempts to get government support, Goya was saving money to go to Rome at his own expense. An extremely risky and unusual undertaking for a poor young man of that time. The journey from Madrid to Rome then took up to 2 months. It was expensive, long, and risky. Without patronage, usually artists didn't dare to take such a step, but not Goya. Even then, let me draw your attention to that. His path was rather anti-academic, I would even say rebellious, in Rome and later in Venice. The 24-year-old artist spent 2 years studying the works of Titian, Raphael, and Veronese, the greatest masters of the Renaissance. For him, it's like reaching Alibaba's cave and gaining access to the coolest treasures and painting tutorials. He even started a special album, a so-called Italian notebook, which is how we can now judge this period of his life. In it, he recorded all the drawings, the parts of frescoes he liked, notes, and his financial expenses. And in 1771, he made a 3rd attempt to participate in a competition, this time at the Parma Academy of Fine Arts. In Italy, he was cunning and called himself Ernst the Roman, and after 2 years of staying in Rome, he had the formal right to do so and was a student of Bayo. Look at the high level of mastery he achieved by the age of 25. However, even though as many as 6 jury members voted for the work, it still did not receive first place. The theme of the competition was historical genre painting, and the subject itself fit this requirement perfectly. However, Goya additionally included mythical characters, the Minotaur and Victory descending in a chariot, thus mixing historical truth with myth. and that was strictly forbidden, but even with such tendencies, he still received the second prize. After that, Goya suddenly goes to his hometown of Zaragoza. There is a myth that his father died, but in reality, that will only happen 10 years later. Art historians are puzzled by the artist's sudden escapade to his hometown, but everything is easily explained by filming. The thing is, Goya wanted to get access to royal palace commissions, and Bayev, being a royal artist, was ready to recommend him. But for that, he needed a good portfolio, which Goya didn't have at the time, so he decided to return to Saragossa, but now in a new capacity. He lived and worked all the way in Madrid, helped with work at the king's court, had been to Rome, and was considered a student of Bayev, the official artist of the royal family. This was already a completely industrial, different status, which, in theory, was supposed to help him get major commissions, and such a commission soon appeared. A competition was announced to paint the ceiling of the Church of Del Pilar's chapter. A strict requirement for participating in the competition was having experience in fresco painting. It's quite a complex technical process, and Goya had just such experience. As a presentation for the competition, he created a sketch and completed a small section of fresco for the committee. However, he had a formidable competitor, González Velázquez. Don't confuse him with Diego Velázquez from Madrid, but that one asked for 25,000 reales for the work, plus travel expenses from Madrid. And the newcomer Goya, in order to secure the much-needed contract, agreed to 15,000 reales, which is approximately 120,000 to 150,000 euros. The committee considered his experience and price acceptable, and the commission went to Goya, who completed it with honor, creating a large fresco of the adoration of the name of God. In just 4 months after that, he became the only artist in Zaragoza with such experience, and clients started coming to him. Soon he was invited to the Carthusian monastery of Aula Dei, near Zaragoza, where over the course of 2 years, he created 11 large compositions on the theme of the life of the Holy Virgin Mary. Only 7 remain. The rest were damaged during the church's reconstruction. He had built up a sufficient portfolio to now apply for commissions from the royal palace through the mediation of BOEO. Of course, for this, he needed to obtain a special royal permit. Let's call it a license for simplicity. For this, he had to pay a fee for the opportunity to work with the biggest client in the country and one of the largest in Europe, and Francisco. Goya paid 400 reals, about 4,000 euros for such a license, which set a record for artists in Zaragoza. And here lies another popular myth. Supposedly Goya's work was so highly valued that even the royal fee was waived for him. It was 300 reales higher than even his teacher, José Luzán, who at the time paid 100. But in reality, the amount of such a fee was equal to half the annual salary for the position the candidate was applying for. The positions and their salaries were different, so the fees varied as well. The position Goya was applying for was not a dream job, but it not only opened the way for him to receive commissions from the court, but also raised the artist's status, which usually immediately affected his rates and expanded his circle of clients. However, for Goya, the royal license had another effect, an emotional one. Francisco Goya had by then become the most respected artist in all of Aragon, and now he could take another important step. He returned to Madrid and proposed to Francisco Bayeu's sister, Josefa Bayeu. And here we have another myth, that the woman was already pregnant by Goya at that time, but there are no documents confirming this. The myth arose from the suddenness of the marriage after his return, but in reality, we already know that the Zaragoza period was just preparation. Francisco had known Josefa for a long time, even back in Madrid, and the only thing that kept him from proposing to her was the difference in their social status. But the status of official church artist, his recent successes, and most importantly, the royal license. Although it did not put him on the same level as the official court painter, which was her brother, it did close the gap, enough to make the marriage possible. You see what this impudent man did? He took everything that wasn't meant for him. A trip to Rome, underbidding for a commission, a fresco, and a woman of higher status than himself. He even lived above his station in his brother-in-law's house, and eventually started working on commissions for the court. As an artist creating cartoons for tapestries, he was officially an artist of the Royal Gobelins Manufactory. It wasn't the most important position, and not even a court appointment. Rather, it was a technical role that turned into a 17-year probation period for an artist without noble birth. And it was this role that opened the way for Goya to the very top, a path where many trials, disappointments, and even the Inquisition awaited him. At that time, Spain was ruled by Charles III, an enlightened monarch who promoted art as a tool for cultivating taste, together with his chief court painter, Mengs. They tried to get rid of the extravagance and excess of the Baroque, steering the court's aesthetics toward the restraint of classicism. They also began to move away from exclusively religious and mythological subjects as dictated by classicism, turning their attention to genre painting with scenes from everyday life. Even some cautious satire was allowed. As you will soon see, the power of the Inquisition under Karl III was not as extensive. Therefore, the timid sprouts of free will immediately began to grow in the favorable soil of the Spanish court, and this created ideal conditions for a very special sprout, which was Goya. So what kind of cartoons did Goya make for the Spanish crown? Charles III planned a complete redesign of the palace, and this grand idea included countless tapestries hanging on the cold walls of the palace. In fact, it was the same painting, done in oil on canvas, in a size identical to the future tapestry. The artist painted the picture, and the weaver placed it under the stretched tapestry base on the frame, through which the cartoon showed through, and sort of traced it, only using threads. You know, like a cross-stitch pattern? The tapestry image itself was formed on the reverse side of the fabric, and the final tapestry always turned out to be a mirror image of the cartoon. The so-called cartoon was the basis of any tapestry. In fact, Goya painted the same pictures in oil on canvas, which, after the tapestry was made, were either stored or sold. But they had one very annoying limitation. Complex and subtle color transitions, in fact, the most interesting ones for any artist of that time to master their skills. It was technically impossible to weave them, so the creator of the cartoon always had to simplify the image so that the weaver could bring the idea to life. And of course, in those times, when a painting was valued for its masterful resemblance to reality, this did not allow such cartoons to compete with real paintings in terms of quality and subtlety of painting. But even here, Goya will find a way out by focusing on the narrative component. This will cause many inconveniences and even excitement. The Inquisition, however, will forever set him apart in the world of artistic thought and even change the direction of art development. The first royal commission for the 29-year-old Goya in 1775 was cartoons for a series of tapestries for the dining room of the Prince of Asturias, the future Charles IV, in the Escorial Palace. They depict hunting scenes, and Goya himself was also fond of hunting. Francisco created 5 compositions and received 8,000 reales for them, which is about 80,000 euros. Then he created a series of panels for the dining room of the same Prince of Asturias, this time in the Palace of Asturias. Among them stand out Dance on the Shore of Monsanores, Fight in the Tavern, Maya and Masks, The Kite, and The Umbrella. The experience of working with Karl IV would later prove to be decisive for the artist's career. Remember this. As you can see, all these tapestries contained scenes from traditional Spanish life. This was something completely new, yet so traditional and even patriotic. And Goya's ideas for Spanish themes soon became fashionable at the court. Goya's debut was so successful that by 1779 he was able to present 4 of his own paintings. It should be noted that the royal license itself did not give the king access only to commissions, which were denied as a subcontractor. Only the official court painter could have access to the king and, moreover, paint portraits of the royal family, the highest and most honorable position for an artist of that time. Goya, of course, felt limited and undervalued. His position did not allow him to fully express himself. And, as you already understand, he had no shortage of ambition and enterprise. He wanted to become the very best. But the position of court painter was already taken by his brother-in-law, and a real competition began between the two artists. So, in the early 1780s, Goya, relying on his already considerable 5 years of experience working for the court, submitted an official request to become a court painter, but he was refused. Bayeux, already being a court painter, simply did not support his candidacy, not blocking a positive decision, but also doing nothing to help Goya. Then Goya made efforts in another direction, and in that same year, 1780, he was accepted into the San Fernando Academy as an academician. For this, he submitted an admission piece, Christ on the Cross, to the commission, which was reviewed and his candidacy was approved. And this became an important administrative turning point in his career and the first recognition of Goya as an authoritative and accomplished artist. He paid the admission fee, the same 400 reales, it seems everything was 400 back then, and became an academician. He was 34 years old. But soon, the professional rivalry between Goya and Bayou reached a new level, and a serious conflict occurred that determined the entire future fate of the artist. The same Saragossa Cathedral, Del Pilar commissioned the painting. The project cost as much as 60,000 reales, and Bayou was put in charge of it. One of the domes went to Goya, and he very quickly finished it with the fresco Queen of Martyrs, in which he first revealed himself as an original artist. But the originality of the painting, namely the sharp contrasts of light and shadow and the overly expressive figures, did not please Bayou, who was a supporter of restrained classicism. Remember, the commission didn't like it either, and they demanded that the fresco be redone. Goya flatly refused, stating that the criticism was unprofessional and biased. In response, the church refused to work with the artist from then on, and the relationship between Bayou and Goya deteriorated significantly. This conflict revealed for the first time the differences between the style required by the rules and the artist's own vision, the way he saw the development of his own style. The conservative norms of classicism became restrictive, and once again we see exactly the same situation as with Edouard Monet, the Impressionists, or Van Gogh. When under strict rules and limitations, the only path for a truly talented artist is rebellion, and the stronger the restrictions, the more explosive the outburst will be. By that time, Goya had already amassed a decent fortune of 100,000 reals, about €1,000,000, and soon moved out of his brother-in-law's house. Having gained independence, he began to paint portraits of the nobility more often, became a fashionable court portraitist, and soon even received a major commission from the king's younger brother, Infante Don Luis. For two paintings, the equestrian portrait of Doña Valabriga and the family of Don Luis, he was paid as much as 30,000 reals. In 1785, 39-year-old Goya met the family of the Marquis de Peñafiel, who became his regular patrons for 30 years, and a little later that same year, he became the vice director of the Royal Academy. His career was developing rapidly, and then Mengs, the first royal painter, died. The structure of the court painters naturally began to change, and a vacancy appeared at the court. And in 1786, Goya submitted another petition for the title of Royal Painter, which this time, considering all his honors, his academic title, and 11 years of experience creating cartoons for palace tapestries, was approved. His salary was 15,000 reals per year, but this was not yet the position of chief court painter. At that time, there were 3 ranks of artists at court. The first and lowest in the hierarchy was Royal Painter, Pintor del Rey, the very title that Goya received. There could be many artists with this title. They served the decorative needs of the court, painted portraits of the nobility, but did not have access to the royal family and were not allowed to paint their portraits. The second rank was court painter, Pintor de Cámara. This position granted access to the royal family and their commissions. Painting portraits of the sovereigns was the main duty of the court painter. He always had to be present at court, which was a great honor. The third high rank at court was the first court painter, an example being Pintor de Cámara. In addition to having access to the royal family, the first court painter oversaw all artistic matters at court, organizing commissions, distributing assignments, appointing positions, and supervising the court's decorative programs. So, Goya finally received a significant promotion, but for now he was at the lowest level of the royal hierarchy. The artist constantly honed his technique, and paradoxically, the technical limitations of creating tapestry cartoons began to influence his style in a unique way. He began to abandon insignificant small details. His brushstroke became broader and more sweeping, which added dynamism to his paintings. His unique style began to emerge, initially dictated by limitations, but eventually developing into new techniques that would fully reveal themselves a little later. Goya remained both a painter of cartoons, although he did not like this position, and a court portraitist at the same time. However, the complexity achieved by Goya in his sketches caused complaints from the weavers, who considered it impossible to reproduce all the tonal subtleties that the artist introduced into his works, especially the lighting effects. In 1778, the director of the factory officially protested, claiming that it was impossible to convey the shades of light in their changing tones on fabric. Goya ignored these complaints and felt justified. When the king received him for the first time the following year to look at his latest compositions, it was a great honor. Many people never got a personal audience with the king. Having lived at court all his life, he continued to paint cartoons for tapestries, until an illness caused by constant contact with lead white temporarily paralyzed him and made him lose his hearing. But more on that later. During his time in this position, he created 4 series of paintings. The first series had 9 scenes with hunting themes, and the second series depicted popular entertainments. As a rule, these were rural leisure activities. The third series was a group of 4 paintings allegorically related to the seasons. Spring, or the flower sellers. Summer, or the threshing floor, the largest canvas ever painted by Goya, measuring 3 by 6.5 meters. Autumn, or the grape harvest, and winter, or the snowfall. The fourth series was painted after the death of Charles III in 1788, when Goya became the court painter to Charles IV, the very same person for whom he completed his very first commission as a royal artist. The fourth series was a series of satirical paintings, still about the simple life of Spanish society, but this time focused on ridiculing its vices. And this was his first attempt to bring his personal perspective as an artist into his paintings, not just to create a composition, but to give it meaning and even a sense of mockery. As you can see, Goya is actively exploring the life around him. Unlike classicism, whose main values were portraits, battle scenes, religious and mythological subjects, Goya's curiosity was stirred by real life. This is not yet realism, the scenes are often invented, but it is certainly one of the very first attempts in art history to reinterpret the very purpose of painting, in which the artist is not just a creator of beauty, but also an observer, a person capable, with his unique skills, of doing more than just making a mere copy of reality. Not a depiction of entirely man-made scenes and compositions, but rather capturing the act of observing the surroundings with real emotions and the true, powerful beauty of life. And just as importantly, to give the painting a message from the artist. As I already mentioned, in 1788, Charles III died, and his son, Charles IV, ascended to the throne. Historians agree that the two Charleses were opposites. Charles III was a decisive reformer, while Charles IV was an uncertain and inexperienced king. Therefore, when he ascended to the throne at the age of 40, he almost immediately lost his influence, which passed to his favorite, Godoy, and the queen. This is an important point, remember it, as it will greatly affect Goya's fate. A new broom always sweeps differently, a new sovereign. He almost always put his close associates in positions, completely changing the structure and hierarchy of the court, replacing people with his own. All the artists at court, when the ruler changed, could either confirm their status, be demoted, or even be expelled from the court. After Menx's death, Boyo became the first court painter, 2 ranks above Goya. And as you remember, their relationship was not the easiest. Here, Goya's previous experience working with the future king came in very handy. Remember, I mentioned that Goya's first commission was tapestries for Charles IV's palace. Moreover, the new queen, Maria Luisa of Parma, was very fond of Goya. She loved his style and constantly commissioned portraits from him. In other words, a window of opportunity opened up for Goya to rise one more step, and he submitted an official request for the position of court painter. In fact, he already had experience making portraits of the then future queen, so he had basically already passed his probation period and was very much liked by this important client. But Bayo was not at all pleased with Shuren's promotion, and he tried to prevent this appointment by writing a dissenting opinion, in which he expressed the view that Shuren was not suitable for this important role. He also noted that his style was inconsistent. He often deviates from the canons of classicism, and his painting is not sufficiently reliable, hinting at satirical scenes. However, this time Boyo's opinion was overruled by the royal couple, and the 43-year-old artist from a poor family in Zaragoza became a court painter. Goya soon learned about the intrigues that Boyo was plotting against him, and this led to a final break in their relationship. But now, under new circumstances, the status gap between the artists was reduced to just 1 step. In that same year, 1789, a very important event took place in Europe that affected all monarchies without exception. In neighboring France, the French Revolution began, and it lasted for a whole 10 years. And in 1792, the First French Republic was proclaimed in France, which greatly limited the power of the monarchy and marked the beginning of the end of absolutism in Europe. These new alarming trends also reached neighboring Spain and greatly changed the mood at the court. The Spanish monarch, like all the monarchs in Europe, began to fear the spread of these dangerous ideas, which were usually carried by enlightened intellectuals and the bourgeoisie, to which obviously Goya also belonged. He willingly communicated with the so-called Ilustrados, Jovellanos, Saavedra, and the Ilustrados. In Spain at that time, intellectuals who advocated for reforms in education and art and for enlightenment were called Ilustrados. However, after the French Revolution, the very word enlightenment began to be considered suspicious, and those who favored enlightenment were seen as potential spreaders of revolutionary contagion. From then on, the main quality of any courtier became loyalty. At the same time, at court, the rapid rise of the low-born Manuel Godoy, the queen's favorite, takes place. With the king being indecisive and weak-willed, Godoy effectively seizes power at court. He dislikes the old aristocracy and regards intellectuals with suspicion. Goya, with his constant nonconformity and his attempts to look too closely at life, does not appear to be the most trustworthy. Persecutions begin at court, and the prudent Goya, following the advice of his friends the Ilustrados, decides to leave the court for a while to avoid confrontation and wait out the storm. And he goes to Valencia, where he is appointed to the Royal Academy of Fine Arts of San Carlos, and then to Andalusia, where he will spend 2 years until he is struck by the storm of illness. There is still no consensus about the origin of such a sudden illness, but according to reports, Goya was temporarily paralyzed, and after recovering, he irreversibly lost his hearing. I still tend to believe the theory about the influence of lead white, which aggravated an already existing predisposition. This was the most common illness among artists of that time. Deafness, paradoxically, played the most ironic role in the changes for which Goya was already psychologically prepared, but which could not manifest themselves in his work. It allowed him to concentrate on what he saw, to disconnect from the noise of the world and the opinions of those around him. Deafness, in essence, blocked out the conservative voices of the court and his colleagues, leaving him in complete, impenetrable silence. It made the colors and brightness of what his eyes saw and what his imagination created much more vivid. Upon returning to Madrid, Goya finally refused to create sketches for the tapestries, citing illness. The following year, he painted the famous portrait of the well-known actress Maria Rosario del Fernandez, nicknamed La Tirana. And in 1795, Goya created a portrait of the Duke of Alba and then a full-length portrait of his wife. There is an opinion that Goya had a love affair with the influential Duchess of Alba, who would look after him and support him for the rest of his life. It is this excessive care that raises suspicions, but there is no evidence for it, so I will leave these assumptions to your discretion. During this period, Goya begins to lead a double life. A serious illness which preceded his deafness showed him that his life could end at any moment. It awakened a long-dormant desire to create art that would reflect real life, not the artificial poses of the palace nobility. But to do this, he would have to work twice as hard, which is exactly what he does. He has been trying to move away from commission painting for a long time. For example, in 1787 he painted The Attack on the Stagecoach, and in the 1790s he returned to this subject again, painting The Attack on the Bandits. It's very interesting to compare them. If the first painting was almost a pastoral scene, the last one was filled with anxiety and cruelty. It can be said with confidence that it was during this period that Goya dared to take steps he had long wanted to take, steps he had cautiously attempted before, but only hinted at, only touched upon lightly with his brush. Steps that would lead him to his famous black paintings and the terrifying Saturn devouring his son. At this time, in France, Louis XVI is executed, and Napoleon Bonaparte comes to power. Spain attacks revolutionary France to crush rebellious ideas at their root, but couldn't get very far. The war stalled and eventually ended in a stalemate and peace. But Bonaparte doesn't need reconciliation. He only needs a respite, and soon Europe will plunge into hell. And in 1795, Goya's brother-in-law Bayeux dies, and the coveted position of first court painter becomes available. Goya, of course, immediately applies for the vacancy, but the queen's favorite blocks his request, considering the artist, in the atmosphere of revolutionary paranoia, too free, too independent, and dangerous. Besides, how will he manage all the artistic work at the palace if he's deaf? Instead, he is given Bayou's vacant position at the Academy and appointed Director of Painting at the Royal Academy of San Fernando with a salary of 4,000 reales. He will resign from the position in 2 years. In the meantime, he paints numerous portraits of the royal family and courtiers, diligently establishing himself as the most sought-after artist in Spain. And at the same time, he is making sure that the other side of his painting, the so-called cabinet works, doesn't look like rebellion. These cabinet works are a group of small format pieces. Among them are vivid examples of the so-called terrible sublime, such as the madhouse, shipwreck, fire, fire at night, attack by bandits, and the interior of a prison. Their subjects are already frightening and gloomy in themselves, completely unlike court painting. And the technique, thanks to the sweeping brushstrokes, resembles a sketch and is full of contrasts and dynamism. These small works, created with expressive gestures, can definitely be considered one of the milestones marking the beginning of Romantic painting. The series continues with works about Caride and concludes with the painting Wandering Comedians, which contains the first elements of grotesque and satire, a precursor to the black paintings, reflected in the distorted faces of the characters and the sweeping, almost careless brushstrokes. At the same time, he begins working on his famous Caprichos, a collection of etchings. This is an etching on copper with an etched design, a biting satire on everyday life. The idea for it came to him during a trip to southern Spain, where he was trying to recover from his illness. Along the way, he made sketches based on his observations of the surrounding life. This amazing and extremely bold project for those turbulent times would become a breath of fresh air for the artist, who was trapped in the necessity of painting one portrait of the nobility after another. A kind of rebellion of boiling creativity that couldn't find an outlet in official commissions. Remember, I always told you that art is clearly divided into two periods. Before Impressionism, when a painter's work was determined by the client and the artist was extremely limited in their freedom of self-expression. Otherwise, the client could just refuse to pay for the commission if they got a portrait like this. And the period after Impressionism, when artists began to paint what they wanted and how they saw it, achieving success, and only rarely took on commissioned work. Painting itself in the 18th century as a craft was quite an expensive undertaking. There were no fairs, exhibitions, or museums at that time, and paintings served purely a decorative function. It was almost impossible to sell experimental paintings, so very few artists dared to paint something just for themselves. It was a different story with engravings and etchings. They were relatively cheap and easy to make, could be printed in as many copies as you wanted, and you could arrange to have them placed in some shop and let people buy them if they wanted. It was at this stage, and after overcoming his illness, that Goya began doing everything possible to create works that were not connected to the duties he had acquired at court. That's exactly what he writes to Bernardo de Iriarte, the director of the Academy, informing him about the change in direction of his painting, while carefully describing it as an experiment and calling them cabinet paintings. And once again, using his illness as an excuse, he writes, "To occupy my humbled imagination, reflecting on my troubles, and to partially compensate for the enormous expenses they have caused me, I devoted myself to painting a series of cabinet paintings in which I was able to make observations, which are usually not allowed in commissioned works, and in which whim and inventiveness have no room to develop." Goya began working on the Caprichos in 1797 and worked on them for 2 years, but at the same time he was also painting his experimental works, but he acted very cleverly. At his own expense, he created and gave Duke Osuna 6 small paintings, the sinister subjects of which anticipated the Caprichos, and among them, the Witch's Sabbath and the Spell stand out. The Caprichos themselves were released in 1799 when the artist was already 54 years old. The Caprichos began to be sold in a small perfume shop, but only 27 copies out of 300 were sold before the Holy Inquisition intervened. Meanwhile, Spain and all of Europe plunged into chaotic anti-revolutionary wars. Spain began to draw closer to France, and England attacked Spain. At that time, England was the strongest naval power with colonies all over the world. As a result of this war, Spain lost contact with its vast colonies in South America and suffered enormous financial difficulties. Amidst all this chaos, the court Camarilla forced Godoy to resign, and Goya immediately submitted another petition for the position of first court painter. This time, together with Mariano Salvador Maella, he became the first court painter with a salary of 50,000 reals a year. without paying taxes, plus 500 ducats for maintaining his carriage. He finally reached the top. By the age of 54, Goya had become the most important artist in Spain and one of the most prominent in Europe. There was no one above him anymore. There was nowhere higher to go, and the last obstacle to his creativity, possible career consequences, was removed. But let's return to the Caprichos, which translates from Spanish as whims. This is how Goya himself advertised his future project, a collection of engravings on whimsical subjects, invented and etched by Don Francisco Goya. The author, convinced that condemning human mistakes and vices, although it seems to belong to eloquence and poetry, can also be the subject of painting, chose suitable themes for his works. From the multitude of extravagances and follies common in any civilized society, as well as from vulgar passions and lies justified by customs, ignorance, or self-interest, those which, in his opinion, are most suitable for providing material for mockery, and at the same time awakening the artist's imagination. The themes of these engravings are mainly focused on witchcraft and prostitution, as well as anti-clericalism, criticism of the Inquisition, condemnation of social injustice, superstitions, lack of education, marriages of convenience, and other vices, as well as references to medicine and art. The most famous of them, "The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters," is an allegory of the wild and evil nature of man, asserting that only enlightenment and reason serve as a barrier to its awakening. I am deliberately showing you the engravings and the court paintings alternately so that you can understand the contrast between the two sides of Goya as they were created at the same time. As you can see, Goya had a very low opinion of humanity, but it seems to me that if I or you lived in those cruel times, we wouldn't be much different from him in our contempt for society. With these engravings, Goya established himself not just as an artist, but as a thinker, a person capable not only of meticulously copying his surroundings and reality, but also of creating meanings, stories, and provoking doubts, qualities that belong only to a true artist. However, word of the outrageous Caprichos quickly reached the church. And although it was impossible to formally accuse the artist of heresy because he used images that were mocking but still allegorical, the Holy Inquisition made it clear that it had taken notice and expressed its displeasure at the way it and the monks were portrayed. In those days, even a hint from the Inquisition was enough to make you think twice, and Goya withdrew the series from sale to avoid complications. There is a myth, yes, Goya's life is simply shrouded in endless myths, that the Inquisition banned the Caprichos. But in reality, it never even came to that, and the royal family didn't even notice this brief escapade of their first painter, and the Caprichos. They were put in a chest, from which they would be taken out 4 years later as a ransom. Goya's little act of audacity would soon come back to haunt him in the most unpleasant way, and in 1800, Goya was commissioned to paint a large group portrait of the royal family, which resulted in the famous painting, The Family of Charles IV. In this painting, Goya once again departs from the accepted solemn conventions and depicts the royal family as an ordinary family, emphasizing the warm relationships between its members. And in the background, look, he painted himself, imitating Velázquez's Las Meninas. He also painted a portrait of Manuel Godoy, the most powerful man in Spain after the king, who returned to the court at the beginning of the 19th century after his victory in the War of the Oranges. During these years, he created perhaps his best portraits. He painted not only aristocrats and high-ranking officials, but also a whole gallery of prominent figures in finance and industry, and above all, his portraits of architects stand out. It was at this time that Goya painted his famous Nude Maja, commissioned by Godoy, which would later be paired with the Clothed Maja. For those times, this was an outrageous painting. Nude female figures never appeared in paintings except in mythological scenes. To depict a naked unknown woman simply as a woman was considered beyond all possible decency, and the Inquisition would come after her as well. Apparently they were commissioned by Godoy because they first appeared in his collection. Joaquin Esquerra del Valle, in his book The Duchess of Alba and Goya in 1928, based on the similarity of the pose and the size of the two Mayas, he claimed that they were arranged in such a way that with the help of a clever mechanism, the clothed Maya would cover the nude one like an erotic toy, from Godoy's secret cabinet. It is known that the Duke of Osuna in the 19th century used the same technique on a painting, which with the help of a spring revealed another image of a nude woman. In general, things are going well. And in June 1800, Goya bought a house for 234,000 reales, over 2 million euros, at the corner of Valdeverde and Dasengano streets, and then another one. His wealth, fame, and career are flourishing, and it would seem that the sky of his future is cloudless and predictable. But in 1802, the all-powerful Duchess of Alba, Goya's patron and protector, dies, leaving Goya exposed before the hostile court that disliked him. Goya's small experiment with the Caprichos does not escape his attention, and he begins to plot intrigues against the artist. The copper plates and unsold copies of the satirical works become toxic for Goya, and in 1803 he decides to present the Caprichos to the king as a pledge of loyalty. But even so, from that moment on, Goya, while remaining at court and keeping his position, no longer receives royal commissions for almost the rest of his life. There will be one exception, but under a different king. As you can see, even such an innocent prank by today's standards, such a desperate attempt to break the rules, was punished, even if the author was the kingdom's leading artist. From this time on, Goya was effectively left out of affairs and went into an inner creative exile. These engravings were officially published for the first time only after Goya's death. In the year under the new government and after the dawn of liberal reforms. Becoming perhaps one of the artist's most significant legacies, and the first artistic satire of such scale in history, becoming perhaps one of the artist's most significant legacies, and the first artistic satire of such scale in history. In 1807, Napoleon Bonaparte, under the pretext of moving his troops to Portugal, de facto occupies Spain. A rebellion erupts in the palace among those unhappy with Godoy's policies. As a result, Charles IV is forced to abdicate the throne in favor of his son Ferdinand VII, but soon Napoleon summons both of them to Bayonne, where Charles IV declares that the abdication was made under pressure. And Bonaparte uses this to force Ferdinand to abdicate the crown in favor of Charles IV once again. And then he himself immediately forces him to abdicate the crown and appoints his brother Joseph Bonaparte as king. That's the chaos that was happening there, my friends. Ferdinand ascends the throne in Madrid, and all the court nobility, including Goya, swear allegiance to him. The artist manages to keep his position, even though without a salary. He paints a couple of portraits of Joseph Bonaparte and his generals. And in 1811 he even receives the Royal Order of Spain from the new suzerain, and in 1812 his wife Francisca passed away. During his son's inheritance process, an inventory of the artist's property was made. That's why we know for sure that besides the two houses, it was valued at 357,728 reals at that time, which is about 3.5 million euros. That's quite a safety cushion. However, outside the palace, there was a general European war for independence. Napoleon Bonaparte had conquered almost all of Europe, invaded Russia, and the countries united to overthrow the invader. The war continued until 1814, when Bonaparte was overthrown by joint efforts, and all the countries regained their governments. These troubled and frightening times did not pass Goya by, and between 1810 and 1815, having already been burned once by Caprichos, he secretly worked on a new series of etchings, The Disasters of War, in which he depicted with documentary cruelty and ruthlessness all the ugliness, inhumanity, and senselessness of war, which brings nothing but suffering to all people. He engraved 82 plates, but during his lifetime he printed only 2 copies, one of which he gave to his friend. This series remained his secret, a silent challenge to the hypocrisy and cruelty of society. The first edition was published only in 1863, 50 years later, at the initiative of the Royal Academy of Fine Arts of San Fernando. We are almost at those very black paintings, but first I have to show you 2 more paintings that he created in 2014, right after Bonaparte's defeat. After the end of the war in 1814, I began creating 2 large historical paintings representing his interpretation of the events that took place on May 2 and 3, 1808 in Madrid, when a spontaneous popular uprising against Napoleon occurred, marking the beginning of the Spanish War of Independence. Armed with knives and sticks, the townspeople tried to drive the invaders out of the city, but against professional troops armed with muskets, they could do almost nothing. The uprising was brutally suppressed, along with a wave of repression, and many rebels lost their lives. It is this strong emotion that Goya shows in his famous masterpiece, highlighting the white shirt emerging from the darkness, the rebel spreading his arms in a bold gesture, and the faceless soldiers hiding behind their weapons, a gray mass that destroys life. After Ferdinand VII returned to the throne, hard times began for everyone who had sworn loyalty to Bonaparte. Persecution of the entire enlightened class of scholars and artists began again. Almost the entire court was forced to flee, and some emigrated to France. Goya was no exception, and although no one formally tried to strip him of his position, the attitude toward him was cold and unfriendly. Naturally, in these conditions, there was no chance of getting official commissions from the court. And then, to make matters worse, the Inquisition restored by Ferdinand started stirring, digging up old sins, and took issue with the nude Maja, initiating a trial against the artist for indecency. However, since the painting was kept in Godoy's private office and was not public, and realism without a mythological plot was not prohibited as such, the Inquisition lacked purely legal grounds for the accusation, and Goya was acquitted. Up until 1819, Goya mainly painted portraits of the children of his old patrons on commission. Ferdinand was hostile toward him, so the new court hardly commissioned anything from him. And in 1819, he bought a country house for 60,000 reals, which soon became known as the House of the Deaf Man. It was located beyond the bridge leading to Segovia, and it would become both the repository and the reason for the creation of the black paintings, which still frighten viewers to this day. The reason for buying this house may have been his desire to live there with Leocadia Zarilla, his maid, who became the artist's lover after his wife's death. For safety from rumors, since she herself was married to Isidoro Weiss, it was with her that he lived, and perhaps he even had a daughter with her, Rosaria Weiss. That was how he planned to spend the rest of his years far from the court, painting and enjoying life. But in 1820, another palace coup took place, as a result of which Ferdinand had to swear allegiance to the constitution. I think anyone would get tired of this chaos and retire to their home. I certainly would. The walls of the new house were already painted, but Goya decided to repaint them. Now finally, he had nothing to lose. There were few commissions, but he had money. And starting in 1820, the 74-year-old artist set out to combine the ideas and vision he had expressed in his engravings with real painting. He painted 16 frescoes directly on the walls of the house, 7 on the first floor and 8 on the second floor. These works became the culmination of his disgust with society. The characters depicted in them are perversely corrupt, their actions are insane, and the setting is repulsive. Perhaps his most famous painting, Saturn devouring his son, symbolizes the present devouring its own future, royal reaction devouring enlightenment. The Witch's Sabbath demonstrates the depravity and foolishness of human traditions and superstitions. And the dog, half submerged in water, my favorite and in my opinion the most unusual painting in the series, symbolizes helplessness and despair. I think the artist himself, who unsuccessfully tried to stick his head out of the conservatism of classicism, very few of Goya's contemporaries knew about these paintings. Just like his etchings, the artist was forced to hide his most intellectually rich works. The paintings and engravings that made him not just a court painter, but a symbolic genius of his time, remained unrecognized and unknown for a long time, as often happens with artists who are ahead of their time, and only such artists become truly great, the greatest. Goya created his works away from prying eyes, deaf to outside criticism, on his own initiative, when nothing and no one interfered with his creativity. And you have to admit, these dark, even repulsive and almost sloppy paintings make a much stronger impression than the festive and technically perfect portraits of the nobility. Now you understand what it was like for talented artists in almost every era. They had to live a double life, one side of which had to earn a living and follow strict rules, while the other, the true creative side, demanded self-expression through experimentation, breaking the norms and rebellion. And the harsher the shackles, the more explosive the protest will be. And in 1823, I promise, this will be the last upheaval. In our story, Ferdinand returns to Madrid once again, and with the help of the French, wins back his throne. Persecutions of intellectuals begin again. The Ilustrados and Goya transfer the house to his son, takes a leave of absence, and leaves for Bordeaux, to France, where many of his friends had already moved long ago, and where he would spend the rest of his life. He would return to Madrid once more to finalize his retirement, and then leave again the country to which he had given so much, and which accepted from him only what flattered it. Without ever stopping his work, he would die in Bordeaux at the incredible age of 82 for that time, from cancer, surrounded by friends and family. He was buried the next day at the La Chartreuse cemetery in Bordeaux, in the mausoleum next to his good friend and brother-in-law Martin Miguel de Goycoechea, who had died 3 years earlier. After 60 years of neglect, Spain came to its senses and tried to transfer the artist's remains back to his homeland. But when the mausoleum was opened, it was discovered that someone had stolen Goya's head. Historians agree that the head was stolen by phrenologists, members of a popular late 19th century pseudoscientific movement that believed in a connection between genius and the shape of the skull for study. Initially, Spain saw no reason to transport an incomplete body and abandoned the idea. But another 10 years later, they reconsidered, and in 1899, they finally transported the artist's remains and reburied them in San Antonio de la Florida. So now Goya lies headless in the church that he himself painted, in the country whose follies he so sharply mocked in his Caprichos, and where, from all the upheavals, anyone could have lost their head, even someone far less brilliant than he was. You see, my friends, it's impossible to understand an artist's work without understanding his journey and environment. That's why I always guide you through their fascinating life stories. And we observe the evolution of artists, step by step, absorbing their aspirations, doubts, fears, and failures. Paintings will only reveal their stories to those who can look at them through the eyes of their creators, and we still have many such stories ahead of us. Subscribe so you don't miss out. Friends, I have one request for you. I run this channel alone, and each video is a tremendous effort, which is why they come out so rarely. But together, we're creating the best art channel on Runet. There's no doubt about that, and your support would be very helpful to me. Please subscribe, even with the smallest donations here on YouTube or on Boosty or Patreon. The links are in the description, and thank you for watching. Goodbye, everyone.